Okay, well, welcome everyone to this webinar, Why Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom Have Nothing to Do with Each Other, with Stanley Fish. This event is brought to you by the Heterodox Academy community in Canada. My name is Andy Sellwood, and I am a faculty member at Vancouver Community College. I am the moderator for the HXA community in Canada, and I will also be the moderator for today's webinar. So Heterodox Academy was started over 10 years ago in the US by Jonathan Haidt and a group of academic insiders in response to concerns they were seeing in academia around viewpoint diversity, open inquiry, and the lack of space for constructive disagreement. The Canadian HXA community started around 6 years ago and now has campus communities across various universities across Canada. I'd like to start by thanking Neil McLaughlin, who has organized today's event. So Neil is a full professor in the Department of Sociology at McMaster University, and Neil helps to run the HXA chapter at McMaster. So now to our speaker and panelists. So primarily, Stanley Fish is an American literary theorist, legal scholar, author, and public intellectual known for his work in reader response theory, anti-foundationalism, and neo-pragmatism. Fish is currently teaching at the New College of Florida. He is considered a leading figure in humanities and legal studies known for analyzing how interpretive communities shape meaning. Fish has previously served as the Davidson Kahn Distinguished University Professor of Humanities and a Professor of Law at Florida International University and is Dean Emeritus of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So now for our panel. Ewelina Topolska was awarded her PhD in Theory of Literature and Comparative Literature by the Autonomous University of Barcelona in 2014. Since 2015, she has worked at or cooperated with different Polish universities. At the moment, she holds a position of Associate Professor in Humanities at the University of Silesia, as well as teaching position in the Psychology Department of the SWPS University in Wrocław, Poland. Her second career path is psychotherapy. After graduating from an arts therapy program in 2018, she completed a 4.5 year long training in positive and transcultural psychotherapy. Currently, she combines her university obligations with psychotherapeutic practice in her research, focusing on the psychoeducational dimension of theater and literature. She draws extensively on the theories of Erich Fromm and Jonathan Haidt. Jeffery William Donaldson is a Canadian poet and critic. Donaldson was educated at Victoria College, University of Toronto. He teaches American literature, poetry, and creative writing and literary criticism in the English department at McMaster University. Stefan Sicaraffa is an associate professor with the McMaster University Department of Philosophy. He has research and teaching interests in political philosophy, meta-ethics, and the philosophy of law. Okay, so our plan for this session is that Stanley will speak for about 25 minutes. We will then allow each panelist to respond for about 7 to 10 minutes, which could be their own commentary on the topic, could be questions for Stanley, or could be a critique of Stanley's position. We will then have an open discussion of the panel and Stanley for about 10 to 15 minutes. We will then close with a chance for attendees to pose questions to Stanley and the panel via our Q&A feature. So there is a Q&A feature. As an attendee, you can pose questions. So before we get started, I'd like to remind people of the heterodox way. Make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and be yourself. And now I'm going to hand things over to Stanley. You can take it away.
Thank you very much. Do I have to take the humble pledge? The other things I'll sign on to, but let's put it this way. I would love to be able to be humble, but I've never been able to manage it. I have some written remarks, but and I write them because I don't want to exceed the time required, the time assigned rather. But before I make those remarks, I wanted to say something about a thesis that underlies everything that I'm going to say, but is not in fact developed in the paper, so that I'll just boldly state it so that it may help orient your response to what I say. The thesis is as follows. Free speech is not a value or a principle. It is a rhetoric, in the Nietzschean sense of a moving army of metaphors or phrases or slogans. Some of those metaphors and phrases and slogans are well known to members of this panel and to the attendees. Marketplace of ideas, people's right to know, creation of an informed citizenry, the encouraging of dissent. Um, all of these are part of what we might call, in an Aristotelian or Ciceronian sense, a storehouse of talking points to which you might have recourse when you are trying to advance your position. That is all that free speech is, a ragtag collection of metaphors, slogans, metaphors, slogans, and anecdotes. It is nothing more honorable. It is nothing to worship. It is nothing to die for on the beachhead. Having said that, let me begin with the written remarks. There are two quite different ways of thinking about free speech and its relationship, if any, to academic freedom. One way invokes principle and moral logic and begins by declaring free speech a key, even an ultimate value, and then proceeds to argue that any exception to free speech, any limitation on utterance, can only be justified if it survives the strictness of scrutinies. The default assumption in this position is that the value of the freedom of speech, outweighs any disadvantages exercising it may bring about. Thus, for example, as most of you know, the appellate court of the Seventh Circuit in 1978, after acknowledging the harms that would likely follow if a neo-Nazi group were to march through a village populated by Holocaust survivors, nevertheless decided that the First Amendment tells us the march must be permitted. For it's the principle, not contingent effects, that must be attended to. Now, the other way to think about free speech is to take contingent effects seriously and to argue that while as a general rule or rule of thumb, the benefits of allowing speech will likely outweigh the damages speech may produce, there are instances in which the reverse is true. The damages outweigh the benefits, and in those instances, regulation may be justified. This is a pragmatic view, often called balancing, and it received a classic exposition when the great American jurist Learned Hand offered this formula, which is essentially a cost-benefit analysis. First, calculate the cost of allowing a certain form of speech to flourish, and then calculate the cost of censoring it. And depending on which cost is higher, either permit it or regulate it. Now, balancing is resisted by most strong free speech theorists because it is tied to the vagaries of human behavior and circumstance rather than to a bright line rule that can be applied in any and all circumstances. But the truth, I would say, is that even when courts hand down their ruling in the vocabulary of principle, what they are doing, and doing necessarily, is balancing. An opinion may be presented in high-flown universal terms, but the real message is quite local, and that is, today, in these circumstances, we decide to permit or to censor a particular utterance, but on another occasion, when circumstances have changed, we may decide the reverse. I say that courts are doing this ad hoc dance necessarily because the invocation of principle is a non-starter. In order to start, there would have to be in place a firm definition of what speech is. For without such a definition, we would be unable to identify what it is that should be free. Unfortunately, no such definition of speech is available, as we can see by thinking for a moment about the traditional distinction upon which a definition is usually based, and that is the distinction between speech and action. We know that if the First Amendment read, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of action, that would make no sense because abridging freedom of action, declaring some actions illegal, is what Congress does as a lawmaking body. Speech, therefore, must be different from action if it is to be something that we should protect, and if the First Amendment is to have a clear meaning. There has to be, it simply has to be something that can be free that can be free as action clearly is not. What is it? What's the difference? Well, we might say that speech issues from the larynx and involves no physical impingement on the world. It's the realm of thought and reflection and deliberation and distinguishable from the performance of action, and especially from violence. But is it? If I say you can't enter this restaurant or shop, I have impeded your movement. If I say aim, shoot, and fire in the appropriate military context, my speech brings about your death. If as a judge I declare you guilty of a crime, I might well be imprisoning you for years. If I pass on classified secrets to an enemy agent, I am engaging in speech, but I am also committing treason. If I urge a crowd bent on beating you up, I am complicit in the assault, even if I do not physically participate in the beating. So while some speech stops short at the waters of action, some speech doesn't. But which is which? And is there a test for sorting the kinds of speech out? A test that would allow us to say that kind of speech should be free? Not according to Oliver Wendell Holmes, who famously said at the beginning of the 20th century, quote, "Every idea is an incitement to somebody." That is, anything you might say might be received by a hearer as a blow and provoke a counter-response, either verbal or physical. Any speech can, in the right or wrong circumstance, be an action and no longer fall into the category of mere speech. The fluidity, malleability, and porousness of the speech-action distinction is implicitly recognized by our courts when they devise categories designed to camouflage the embarrassing fact that the distinction between speech and action just doesn't hold up. Courts say some actions, like a march through a village, send a message and are therefore symbolic speech. Or alternatively, courts say some speech, like the utterance of fighting words, a legal category, produces effects in the world and is therefore action. These sieve-like categories, with enough ingenuity, anything can be put into them, hold out the promise that something coherent can be made of the free speech universe. But they serve only to illustrate how unbridled and inchoate and accidental that universe is. For now, as we know, there are endless arguments about which actions send messages and which speech acts have action-like impacts, and there can be no resolution of those arguments without a precise identification of what speech is and what it isn't. And the unavailability of that specification is what set the distinction-making process in motion in the first place. Consider as an example of the impossibility of proceeding rationally in the free speech arena the problem of hate speech. Many ask, what, if anything, is to be done about hate speech? But the prior question, which if unanswered stops the interrogation in its tracks, is what is hate speech? Holmes' pronouncement that every idea is an incitement to somebody tells us that anything can be hate speech, but that nothing is, essentially and by right or property, hate speech. In order for hate speech to be a category, there would have to be a set of utterances regarded by everyone as meriting the designation hate speech. All would have to agree that at least this type of speech is hateful. But every effort to identify and quarantine speech clearly beyond the pale has failed, because there will always be someone or some group, a sincere Holocaust denier, a QAnon conspiracy theorist, an Antifada revolutionary, who will say, when they are accused of trafficking in hate speech, "What do you mean hate speech? I am speaking a truth everyone needs to hear." Hate speech, then, is an unstable category, or to be more precise, hate speech is a political category, filled by utterances disliked by those in power and those with sufficient authority and resources to get their preferences and dispreferences enacted in law or custom. Hate speech, like speech in general, is not independently identifiable, and any identification of either speech or hate speech is a political and therefore a challengeable act. You never get to see the thing, hate speech or speech in general, you never get to see the thing in and of itself because there is no thing in and of itself. Now, saying that even the specification of what counts as speech is political will sound oddly in the ears of those who believe with Governor Gavin Newsom, quote, that the doctrine of free speech knows no ideology and is neutral between left and right. But standard free speech doctrine, as pronounced, say, by the American Civil Liberties Union, is an ideology. It's the ideology of liberalism, a way of thinking about political organization that dethrones the authoritative arbiter of everything, a king, a pope, a dictator, and puts in its place the free and autonomous individual, who rather than receiving directions from on high, decides for himself or herself and in the company of other autonomous individuals which direction to go in. The idea is that whatever the truth of a disputed matter is, you are more likely to get there if you and your friends, or even your enemies, freely talk things over, rather than accepting the ready-made accounts promoted by governments and other paternalistic institutions. The process may be messy and full of noise, but in the words of Jonathan Zimmerman in a recent book, quote, we need to have faith that this cacophony of voices will yield a more just and fair society than any set of censors could possibly create. Now, the name given to this process of arriving at the truth by open public debate is the marketplace of ideas, a Holmesian phrase underwritten by two famous statements of Justice Louis Brandeis. The first is, sunshine is the best of disinfectants. And the second is, the remedy for bad speech is more speech, not enforced silence. Together, these two aphorisms tell us that if we allow noxious ideas to be published and spoken, they will be seen for what they are, and they will wither in the light of day. Time and the deliberative exchange of viewpoints will sort things out more definitively than any state regulation of speech ever could. Allow the devil to have his say, and his deviltry in time will be obvious to everyone. Now, this sounds very good. And the only counter-argument I can think of is all of recorded history. All of recorded history. For it has rarely, if ever, been the case that giving lies and distortions airtime leads to their being seen through and rejected. It's often been the case that freely broadcasting lies and distortion leads to their being heard for the first time by listeners who, for whatever reason, find them attractive and become conspiracy theorists on the spot. For example, if you introduce people to the notion that the Holocaust never occurred, some of them will say, I never thought of that, but now that you've told me about it, it sounds right. The operation of the marketplace of ideas, the separating of the true from the false, requires and presupposes a picture of the human mind as an instrument capable of rationally assessing whatever is put before it. However, the human mind is not a recording instrument or a mirror. It's a repository and extension of everything that has been put into it. And there is no muscle of the mind that enables it to get to the side of its contents and look dispassionately at what is being offered to it. Reflection as an act is impossible. The German philosopher, late German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, spent a lifetime looking for what he called the ideal speech situation, the situation in which conversationalists offer to one another propositions that are in no way tainted by preferences, biases, and political allegiance. He never found it. All speech situations are occasions for the performance of what Habermas and other liberal rationalists want to exclude, the promotion of partial and interested points of view, which are presented as if they were not points of view at all, but the simple truth. But that's what speech and the giving of evidence always amounts to, the attempt by one party to put its favored position in the driver's seat and to label alternative positions wrong, illegitimate, crazy, and evil. In its way, it's a glorious spectacle, a circus, and I myself very much enjoyed it. But it is not something we can have faith in. It will never bring us to the River Jordan and to the promised land of undistorted conversation leading to truth. Now, therefore, again, free speech isn't anything. It's just a bunch of things you say when you think your position will be advanced by saying it. Now, you may be surprised to hear that nothing that I have said in the previous paragraphs holds in the world of colleges and universities. For there is a firm definition of what counts as speech and a very persuasive justification in my mind for protecting it. The reason for the difference is the limited and particular context of speech production as defined by the task at hand in the academy, and that is the task of determining the truth of some disputed or unclear matter in the humanities, social sciences, physical sciences, and computer sciences. Inquiry in these disciplines always involves speech, propositions, hypotheses, arguments, citations of evidence, formulas, charts, statistics, and any speech whose aim it is to further the search for truth is to be protected. But it is not protected by the doctrine of free speech, which, as I've already said, is empty. It is protected by the nature of the academic enterprise. Because academic inquiry begins in ignorance, you don't know where the journey will end or where it will take us. No course of reasoning or analysis is either to be anointed in advance or forbidden in advance. As an academic researcher, you can't come to your own conclusion prematurely. You must follow the evidence to the conclusion it finally arrives at. If it does arrive, some puzzles are never solved. If there is any freedom in this process, it belongs to the free-form unfolding of the academic task, not to the researcher, who is constrained by the rules of argument and evidence. The researcher is not free, and his speech is not free. That is all that academic freedom means, following the path of inquiry wherever it leads. Academic freedom does not mean anything else. It does not mean saying what comes into your head. It does not mean proclaiming or urging your views on climate change, transgender care, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Jeffrey Epstein, ICE, Donald Trump, or anything else. It does not mean departing from the syllabus because, in your view, something very important has happened in the world and you feel the need to comment on it. Now, these are all speech acts you can perform outside the academy as a citizen, but when you are participating in an academic setting, you are not a citizen in the usual political sense. You are a member of the academic enterprise and bound by its protocols and imperatives. So, as opposed to the messy universe of free speech, everything is neat and clear in the academic universe. You know what the task is, there's only one, and you know how to determine whether a particular act of speech is a contribution to that task. You ask, is it offered? as a contribution to the truth-seeking project, or does it belong to some other project which may be worth pursuing elsewhere, but not here? So in conclusion, let's get down to particulars. If you nudge your students in the direction of some policy or agenda, you are violating academic freedom and no longer acting as an academic agent. If you allow your students to know what your position on a political matter is, you are also violating academic freedom and acting as an academic agent. If your students want to set aside the assigned readings to discuss something they feel strongly about, they are asking you to violate academic freedom, and you shouldn't do it. If your college requires that all courses be taught with an eye to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that college is violating academic freedom by imposing an ideological conformity in disregard of disciplinary differences. If legislators or governors or boards of trustees mandate that critical race theory or gender studies cannot be taught, they are violating academic freedom. They are shutting down possible paths of inquiry and doing so for political reasons. If legislatures or boards or governors or boards of trustees mandate that American history be taught from the perspective of patriotism, they are obviously violating academic freedom. The academy is a device of inquiry, not a cheerleading squad. And if a national administration demands that you submit your curriculum for evaluation and judgment before federal funds are dispersed, you are being asked to sell your professional integrity for money. If you acquiesced, as many colleges have, you have agreed to become a wholly owned subsidiary and are no longer an academic institution at all. And finally, if anyone requires viewpoint diversity or balance in the curriculum, one from column A and one from column B, he or she or it is violating academic freedom by substituting a political imperative for an academic one. For you must spend class time on a point of view, even if in your academic judgment, the only judgment that counts, it offers little of value to your students. The slogan of intellectual diversity may sound intellectual, but it's a Trojan horse, an effort to sneak in a political program under the guise of a virtuous sounding phrase. Intellectual diversity is nothing more or less than affirmative action for conservatives. Final sentence, the cardinal rule is simple and easy to follow. Do academic work, not political work. Stick to the categories of speech appropriate to the task of academic inquiry, and you cannot go wrong.
Well,
That's it.
thank you so much, Stanley. That was great. We're gonna go into the panelist responses. So we'll start with Stefan, and then Jonathan, and then over to Ewelina. And so the panelists, in the interest of time, maybe sort of ideally 5 minutes for the response, 10 minutes at most, if that's okay. So Stefan, did you want to start with your commentary?
Certainly. So let me begin with a quick thanks to Neil McLaughlin, Heterodox Academy, and of course Stanley Fish for this opportunity to think more carefully about free expression on university and college campuses. I'll also throw out an apology or a caveat. Despite their manifest importance, I've spent embarrassingly little time prior to this opportunity to think through these issues. So what I'm about to say will likely come across as a bit naive to folks who have been wrestling with this topic for many years. Nonetheless, I hope my contribution is consistent with what I take to be the spirit of what we are doing here, providing a platform for any member of our community, expert and not so expert alike, to develop and refine her thinking about free expression on university and college campuses. With that caveat out of the way, let me fix some ideas by coining a term. The term I'd like to coin is a free expression regime. Such a regime has two aspects. First, it is a set of rights to express one's beliefs held by each member of some group of persons that correlates to a set of duties, binding on others not only to refrain from interfering with, but also to some extent to protect these rights of expressions. Second, the regime is not merely an abstraction or standard that ought to be realized. In addition, the duties that constitute the regime are generally observed, and this results in a domain in which the relevant group's members are relatively free to express their beliefs. Now, let me make a further distinction between two very different kinds of free expression regimes. The first we might call a free speech regime. This regime protects and constitutes the domain of free expression that is the object of the rights protecting provisions of many written constitutions, such as the American First Amendment or Section 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The second, the regime of academic freedom, protects the rights of teachers and researchers at academic institutions. With the idea of two distinct kinds of free expression regimes in hand, I can now identify what I take to be a core insight of Stanley Fish's thesis that academic freedom and freedom of speech have nothing to do with each other. As I see it, this thesis is a bit of hyperbole that is a vehicle for a modest, but nonetheless very important and compelling two-part observation. First, the subjects of the two kinds of free expression regimes are different. The free speech regime protects all the members of some political community, whereas the academic freedom regime protects the free expression of researchers and teachers. Second, the underlying rationales for these two regimes are not the same. Now, there are numerous rival accounts of the rationale for the free speech regime. The most famous is the Millian idea that free-flowing speech with little state or social regulation is the surest path to the maximization of true beliefs and ultimately net utility. However, this probably is not the complete story. Other considerations outside the center of Mill's account are arguably important, maybe even more important. These include the citizen's interests of being at home in her social world, the citizen's need to protect her interests in the political domain, and the citizen's interest in having her esteem as a moral equal formed. That's not meant as an exhaustive list. There are a lot of different theories of what's going on, the underlying rationale of free speech regime. To my mind, the rationale of the academic freedom regime is importantly different from the rationale of the free speech regime. The object of this regime is to protect what many, including myself, would argue is or should be the core function of any university or college, namely knowledge production, or in other words, productive scholarly inquiry. Roughly, the idea is that the regime of academic freedom serves the end of productive inquiry. Moreover, on this view, this end is most effectively realized when the content of research and teaching is regulated by the relevant academic discipline standards of inquiry, and the members of that discipline are the ultimate legislators and arbiters of those standards. Many considerations, such as being affirmed as a moral equal and being at home in the social world, that are arguably relevant to this free speech regime, do not apply to the academic freedom regime. A key virtue of the modest thesis is that it clarifies that there are two distinct free expression regimes, the free speech regime and the academic regime, the academic freedom regime. And this distinction matters when thinking about the scope of the duties that we have on university and college campuses to protect the freedom of expression of the various members of these communities. For the underlying rationales and hence the shape of these two free expression regimes significantly differ. However, I would like to call into question one possible less modest reading of Stanley Fish's thesis, this thesis that academic freedom and free speech have nothing to do with one another. This less modest thesis holds that on university colleges and campuses, we need only attend to the academic freedom regime. That doesn't seem right to me. For university colleges and campuses are both political communities in their own right and parts of larger political communities. They're not just centers of academic inquiry, even if that is the core mission of those institutions. In this spirit, allow me to conclude with the following three claims. First, the regime of academic freedom and the regime of free speech are distinct conceptually. They are two distinct kinds of free expression regimes. Moreover, it is important to keep clearly in mind that the scope and underlying rationale of these two kinds of regimes are not the same. Second, both regimes are in play at any university or college campus. And it's important to keep this fact in mind when we are thinking about the rights to free expression for any members of these communities. Third, these two free expression regimes will likely come into conflict, for they are grounded by distinct rationales. For instance, the interests of being affirmed as an equal or being at home in the university or larger political community that ground the student's right to freedom of speech might come into conflict with the interest of effectively advancing inquiry that ground the regime of academic freedom. Accordingly, a key issue for any university or college community is the negotiation of such conflicts between these two free expression regimes. Okay, that's what I've got. I should yield the floor for other folks.
Thanks so much, Stefan. That was great. Stanley, I don't know if you had a few comments or if it's
Oh,
okay, we move
very,
to the
very
next
brief.
person.
I think that Stefan and I are in agreement on many points. My only disagreement is when he calls this second category the free expression regime of the academy. I would say it's the free inquiry regime, because calling it the free expression regime suggests, as many want to suggest, that academic freedom is a subset of freedom of speech. And I want to insist that academic freedom is an entirely different matter in which the usual political justifications and goals of free speech are replaced by the single goal of working out various intellectual problems in the academy, and that free inquiry is only a freedom, as I said in my little piece, that belongs to the process, not to the researcher. I would also finally just briefly challenge Stefan's last statement when he talked about there being that the university and college is not only an academic freedom regime, it's also a political regime. I don't think that's true. He spoke of student rights to freedom of speech. I don't think students have any rights to freedom of speech. I don't think that students have any rights, simply, except the right to competent instruction, which means instruction of the kind that I think everyone on this panel would like to see. People who know what they're talking about, have prepared their classes, don't have political or ideological axes to grind, and design a course which is going to put their students into some kind of position of mastery of material they were hitherto unfamiliar with. That's it. If you, as a student, aren't getting that kind of instruction, you have the right to complain. You have no other rights.
Thanks, Stanley. Great. Well, in the interest of time, I think we'll jump to Jeffrey. So Jeffrey, again, you've got 5 to 10 minutes, and yeah, take it away.
Okay, you can hear me all right.
Yeah.
This is a great pleasure for me to meet Stanley Fish in virtual person. I could remind him of an encounter that I had with him back in the 80s. It was my girlfriend and I speaking to him in a foyer at the University of Waterloo in the late 80s.
I remember the occasion. I don't remember the foyer.
uh, and she was trying to hold Stanley's feet to the fire around the whole reader response debate that was going on at the time. We could say a little bit more about that in a second. And they went at it. Each was given as good as they got, and she came away on dissatisfied and so on. But there was one lesson that really emerged out of it is that you are not going to get around Stanley Fish. There is too much understanding of all of the conditions of speech to catch him out in any way. There is there's always the more that one can think about any problem, and he has the tools to revisit them continually in a way that is going to leave you scratching your head. And I was scratching my head for years later, trying to sort out how I really did feel about the reader response. As a literary critic, that was what got most of my attention. Milton doesn't exist until he's become a part of a reading experience that then extends him into the world of social response and so on. It was all marvelous, and I I agreed with it, and yet I struggled with it at the same time. What I'd like to try on with him in the way that can try and then fail to catch Stanley Fish out is to revisit how his reader response criticism is related to his interest in free speech now. Milton doesn't exist until a reader responds to it. Milton is going to anticipate, and I mean that word in many different ways, but Milton is going to anticipate a reading experience that won't become actualized until somebody reads the poem, so that the poem doesn't exist as a relativity until it has been responded to. And in the same way, we could see today in his later work that there is a further response, a further embodiment of this same practice, that free speech doesn't exist until it has found itself in some frame of reference where it comes to the stakes come to bear, and that those contexts themselves are as relative as there are readers of poems. Of texts. Text doesn't exist until it has been responded to. Free speech is not an issue until it has been actualized in some critical context in the world. What I wonder about, and I guess I feel that it was already active, a bias, to call it that, and he'll answer this, but a bias that the imaginative conditions, the fictive conditions of literary speech don't exist until they've been socialized. And we can see how it's already coming into being in a social context. Readers make texts. Context, social context, call them university context or political debates, wherever you happen to be arguing, are social contexts. And so out of that alignment, it's a very consistent career in that regard, is a bias that it is all rhetorical. And these are the social concern dispositions that we have in the culture generally, that fictive speech is more or less pushed to the side because it doesn't have the social outcomes that that rhetorical speech has. Literature, of course, is rhetorical from front to back, but it is also exactly an expression of the very thing that Stanley Fish also recognizes, in that it is radically relative. And it is in the domain of the radically relative inside literature that it brings something more to the language that we then use in trying to sort out what free speech might actually be. We could take it back to Milton and say, yeah, Milton can write whatever he likes. He's free speech. And then the readers are going to respond to that. So to carry it forward, this is my last attempt to bring it full circle. To carry it forward, we're in a world, it's a social world, it's a technological world. We live with the speed of that world, where arguments about free speech emerge and get shared. They collapse into one another. People get angry. People get frustrated with how these conflicts over what's free speech actually is because of the technology that we inhabit. And it's rushing us to some idea of make up your mind, figure out what context you're speaking in, recognize in a university and environment that these are the containing contexts, and that one has to have a conversation. But at the same time, there is kind of hiding behind it the fact that these are very collapsed, high-speed interactions that have to do with the kind of digital world that we live in. And I wonder whether the disposition that the fictive must become rhetorical and enter into a social context is already a dismissal of the imaginative and fictive conditions in literature itself. And that the very thing that literature gets accused of, which is that it has no relevant outcome, it is always simply imaginative, that we push that aside. Okay, you can say that there's a radical relativity inside the imaginative, but it has no outcome. That's the bias that is built into rhetorical speech in the first place. That what lies at the heart of the literary is the metaphoric, the non-dual, the both-and ways of thinking about what to do with speech acts that are not trying to accomplish anything, right? That makes them both irrelevant and a solution in our age around how slowly we need to think. And my last point then would be that the argument, and Stanley's making it, the argument that we need to slow down inside the university and figure out what the contexts of interaction actually are in this environment, that form of slowness is also the kind of slowness that the non-active initiative that lies in literature already has, right? So that we're moving literature aside because it's not about the real world. It doesn't have outcomes the way we would want it to in rhetorical language. But it is also the means that we have to slow things down and do exactly the kind of wondering about context, about relativity, about what real speech acts are. It already has those built in. So in the end, I wonder whether heterodox generally still doesn't contain the bias that is going to exclude the very problems of what speech is that lie potentially at the heart of literature.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Stanley, did you want to respond briefly, or?
I found that very congenial and interesting and rich. And I want to say that just yesterday afternoon, I concluded the last class in a course I'm teaching on the history of rhetoric, starting with the pre-Socratics, Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, down to the present moment, and figures like Derrida and Habermas and Richard Rorty and others. And what that course, in effect, traces out is a process by which the older arguments about whether the skillful use of words was in the service of truth or, in fact, had the potential to undermine the service of truth. This was the old argument in the text of Aristotle, Plato, Quintilian, and Cicero. At a certain point, that argument, which assumed that speech and rhetoric was one thing, the object, either the world or truth, was another, and the question is, could they be brought together? But at a certain point, and I would identify that point with the work of Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, language got promoted to the status of being constitutive of everything. Or in other words, the entire world is through and through rhetorical, as Jeffrey suggested. And I find that very congenial. I also found congenial his effort to identify what it is about literature that engages us and its relationship to social practice. And here I would cite Michael Oakeshott, the English conservative political theorist, who spoke of university or college life as an interlude, a time when things slow down. Or as I would put it, because of my literary training, quoting Andrew Marvell, a time when time's winged chariot is no longer pressing down on you, and you can turn things over and not worry about exactly where they will lead or where they will, if they will lead anywhere. That would make the academy an essentially imaginative, poetic, and rhetorical experience. And I think there's a great deal to that.
Thanks, Stanley. Okay, well, we'll jump to Ewelina, who I think more is going to come from a questioning, has some questions. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Professor Fish, for this really thought-provoking talk. And thank you, organizers, for making it possible, and Heterodox Academy. I definitely have many questions, but before that, maybe I will allow myself a little comment. So I'm connected to the Zoom from Poland, where I work. Obviously, I can't help but notice that the context, continuing on this idea of context, that you are working with is to a large extent American context, right?
Although I am
And
Polish myself.
that's great to know. So I'm going to chip in with a little Polishness here. And when I read your book on free speech, and I also listened to a couple of interviews, I was thinking about the fact that the whole cancel culture and the urge to exercise free speech at universities obviously stems from North American culture, where universities are not free, right? You have to pay quite large fees for them to attend them. Whereas, for example, in Poland, and that arguably, obviously, everything has its upsides and downsides. Universities are free. There's absolutely no fee to attend university. And in this context, I have this assumption that maybe this influences, right, your sense of entitlement to the free expression and exercising your right of free speech when you get something for free. Let's say it's state funded, obviously, but you do not have to pay for that, versus when you have to pay really big fees for your education. So in this sense, in the American context, the students become clients, right? They become clients. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on this are. To what extent the fact that they are clients influences their perception of their rights to, well, impose certain political agendas or require certain curriculums from the institutions that they pay. Okay, that would be it. Thank you.
Yes, Stanley, did you want to respond?
Oh, sure. Like others, I don't like the rise of the client mentality with respect to the issues that you've just spoken of. I simply don't accept myself the assumptions or presuppositions behind it. Any students who come into my class, even as occasionally full professors sit in my class, sit in my classes. As soon as they're sitting there and it's my class, it's my class. No, the only entitlement in the room is mine. And that is what I'm entitled. My entitlement is to preside over what I hope is a responsible educational experience. And the desires that students might have, because they're paying the freight, as it were, to go in another direction or to not read this material but read some other material, or to have the class organized in a different way. These issues never come up in a classroom of mine because they wouldn't dare. And that is because they know from the very beginning, as I said earlier, this is my class and that's it. I don't care if you're paying $1 million for it. As long as you're in the class, you're mine, wholesale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else, Ewelina?
Uh, yeah, if I may ask one more question related to that, because well, you're presenting here a pretty radical stance of the total ownership of the class. But then we come at the end of the semester, we come to the students' evaluations.
Mhm.
I understand you've been pretty outspoken about that, and you do not approve in general this idea of students' evaluations.
No, I don't.
But they 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 are there probably to I mean they will continue to be made, and they will continue to influence the decisions, right, about faculty who stays and has to go, because they do influence that.
Yes.
And I was wondering, do you see any possible ways of maybe attenuating the impact of students' evaluations, or maybe changing the way that they are made if we cannot get rid of them, as you would probably propose? What can be done about this?
Excellent question, but I don't think I have any answer to it. I saw student evaluations come in, at least at the University of California at Berkeley, in the early 60s. It was originally just an unofficial, campus report that wasn't attached to anything in the university. But I remember the first time in a tenure or promotion meeting that one of my colleagues quoted from an evaluation pamphlet that students had produced, and I thought to myself, "This is very bad, A, and B, there's going to be more and more of it." And of course, there has been. I would, if I had the power, I would outlaw it completely, have absolutely no student evaluations, although I would, as I indicated earlier, certainly have a place for student complaints when the complaint was that the instructor was not, in fact, providing the kind of experience that any student might expect, and that, in fact, was part of the contract he or she signed with the university. But I think we're stuck with student evaluations. I'm sorry. It's one of the many battles that I've lost in my very long life. I should add, just as a matter of biographical non-interest, this is Friday. On Sunday past, I turned 88 years old,
Happy birthday.
and it's an extraordinary surprise to me that I'm still able to so much enjoy my conversation with you here today.
Great.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, what
Happy
we'll
birthday.
Yeah, yeah, happy birthday. So what we'll do is maybe we'll take sort of 10 minutes if Jeffrey and Stefan, if you have any additional questions that you wanted to ask Stanley, and then hopefully we'll have time for some attendee Q&A questions as
I'd,
well.
I'd love to pitch in a little bit more, just based on what Stanley was talking about there and Eva's questions to him, and explain. I was rather myself triggered or traumatized by an event in the classroom this past term. 300 students in the room. I'm teaching David Mamet's Glengarry Glen Ross.
Ah,
uh, a work of real genius, but also problematic in ways that people might be imagining. How is this work situating itself in relation to the attitudes of its characters? And there are some racist comments that are made in the play, and
which Mammoth may well have approved.
yes, no, exactly. That's part of the problem, because
Yes,
those are problematic. The author himself has kind of drifted into areas that then
absolutely.
seem to
Ab-
reaffirm the work itself. But then there's the question of, does the work know more than he himself might know? That's again the reader response puzzle. The students were brilliant, but it came up. There were emails sent around and complaints made that Donaldson had not given them a trigger warning for the racist
Yeah.
comments, and that I brought it up in class, and there were a couple of students who, to their credit, tried to articulate where they were coming from, and they refined their perspective in this way that it wasn't so much that I had assigned a work that has problematic language in it, but that without letting them know that they were going to find this language in it, that I was then the one who was activating that speech.
Mhm.
And was I going to take responsibility for that? And the student walked out because she felt very strongly about this. And it came to the point where what I tried to articulate back was that it was, if I had given one, and there would be good reasons to give a trigger warning in this regard, but then I would be stealing the work's own right to be triggering because these are characters who are losers. They're not succeeding with their attitudes, with what they're trying to sell. It's like a beautiful inquiry into rhetorical language. They're trying to sell something to people, and they fail. They fail. They fail. They fail. And if you're going to have these attitudes, this is where you end up. Seems to be one of the things that the play is exploring. And so I got stuck in that space where I half wanted the students to see the work raw in that sense and have the responses that they had, partly because the work is exploring those responses. And yet I could see how the students might have been annoyed with me for not giving them a heads up.
Mm.
I wonder if you had a solution.
Well, I myself regard trigger warnings negatively. Often I do so because what will trigger something in a student in a negative way is unpredictable. You couldn't possibly give enough trigger warnings to cover
Yes.
all the
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of what is it that a student agrees uh, agrees to experience, at least theoretically and prospectively, when he or she enters a class. You know that you're going to be engaged with material that you have not been introduced to before. That's the point of the entire experience. And there's a likelihood that some of the things in that material will not appeal to you, will and will in fact seem distasteful to you. That
Mhm.
just comes with the territory. My only positive experience with trigger warnings was from the other direction. When I was teaching a course in Milton at Columbia University back in '84, a student before the first class came up to me and said, I am a Christian of a certain persuasion," and then explained what persuasion that she was engaged in, what the principles and assumptions were. She says, "Is there anything in Milton's view of Christianity which would be offensive to my views?" And I said, "Everything." Uh, and she then said, "Thank you very much," and didn't and decided to take another class. And that seemed to me to be entirely rational.
Yes. Yeah, that's where we ended up when I engaged with the students about what to do about these puzzles, is simply to say that at the beginning of the course. Everything in this course is triggering in one way or another.
Yeah.
Let me say that to you without giving any more details, and if you're here, you're here.
It's like the Holmes thing. Every idea is an incitement to somebody.
Yeah.
A wonderful insight.
Yeah,
There was
thank you.
something, sorry, just one last quick point. There was something about the student walking out at that point. I paused. It was a little embarrassing at the moment because it was the elephant in the room that someone wasn't going to have any of this. And I said, can you imagine the courage that it took for her to stand up and leave?
Yeah, I
Right?
agree.
There's conviction. There is, a fundamental embodiment of what you're talking about. She didn't feel that she had agreed to that, so it was being then necessary that you leave.
Thank
Great.
you.
Stefan, did you have an additional question?
I had a kind of quick comment. Yeah, just I'll just be quick with it. So I thought it'd be useful just to, at least for me, hopefully for someone else, to point out what I see as two key similarities between the positions that you described and the one that I was putting next to it, and then one difference. And so I'll bookend it with the similarities. You said something about wanting to make clear that academic freedom is not a species or an instance or an aspect of freedom of speech. It's a different thing, and I wanted to wholeheartedly agree with that. But the way I wanted to cut it up was say, look, we have this general category of free expression regimes, and academic freedom is one, and freedom of speech, the political freedom of speech, is distinct, is a different thing. Now, I think the point of disagreement is I think there's something substantive to the political freedom of speech regime. There's something that's not merely rhetoric. There actually are values that ground that are important to protect. Uh, and then that creates this possibility of a kind of conflict between the freedom of speech regime and the academic freedom regime on a campus because they have different interests that are being protected by the two regimes. But then the point of similarity is going to be that at least in the campus, given what universities and academic institutions, to my mind, should be doing, over and over again, the interests of the academic freedom regime they're generally going to win out against the interest of the free speech regime. But when we can protect the free speech regime on campus, we should do that as well. Anyway, that was just by way of holding the two positions, next to one another and trying to get clearer on like points of agreement and disagreement.
Yeah, I'll say briefly, the key teaching experience for me in my career has been the 11 years that I spent at Johns Hopkins University. And in those days at Johns Hopkins University, I understand that it has changed. The university was focused only on one thing, making the faculty happy. The idea that there are undergraduates there never occurred to most people. And it was always a mystery to me why any undergraduate would want to actually go to Johns Hopkins, where what we sometimes call either praisingly or mockingly the life of the mind was the only value in town. And of course, that was just perfect for someone of my temperament.
Great. Um, so maybe if we do have one question in the Q&A from attendees, but just message to attendees, do use the Q&A and pose questions. So this one is to Stanley from Rachel Altman, who's at Simon Fraser University. So academic freedom also protects faculty members who participate in university governance, like say the Senate, or education councils, that kind of thing, by providing feedback, sometimes critical, on the administration's initiatives. But in the governance context, faculty members may be seeking betterment of the university, not truth, and may be commenting on matters outside of their areas of expertise. How does your understanding of academic freedom apply in this context?
Well, I guess it would apply in exactly the way that the question, as I understand it, suggests. That's another context where it's always a question of what responsibility you've been assigned and are carrying out. If you are a member of some body involved with joint governance of a university, of course, it's the health and flourishing of the enterprise that everyone in the room is trying to support and is perhaps arguing about. So it's not, again, a question of free speech. It's a question of, as you might say, understanding and sticking to the assignment. That's in general my message here, that abstractions, as we usually think of them, whether it's free speech, academic freedom, truth, justice, equality, etc., abstractions emerge in the context of practices. This is, of course, a point associated with pragmatism. Abstractions emerge in the I'm sorry. Abstractions emerge in the experience of practices. They don't preside over practices. So what you have to do always is to understand what is the practice you're engaged in, what are its goals, what are its implicit norms, And when you know when you know that, you know how you are to behave. And I don't see any particular value in describing that behavior as the behavior of free speech or any other abstraction. That's a very Richard Rorty way of talking, and I've always found Rorty's work congenial to my thinking.
Okay, thank you.
By the
Here's
way,
another, yeah.
I don't believe in faculty governance.
Hmm.
I think
Okay.
faculty governance is in general a bad idea. I've been an administrator. The last thing I wanted as an administrator was faculty governance. Faculty governance is just a way in which college college and university professors, um, shall we say, put into action their congenital distrust of administration. That's all it is.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I'm on my college's education council, so yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Okay, so this is from an anonymous
Anonymous
attendee.
among
Pardon me. Um, so you argue that free speech is often rhetoric rather than a neutral principle, while academic freedom is grounded in standards of legitimate
right.
scholarly inquiry and evidence. But if judgments about what counts as legitimate inquiry are themselves implicitly shaped by disciplinary norms, how is academic freedom meaningfully less rhetorical than free speech rather than just a more professionally sanctioned form of boundary drawing and balancing? This seems especially relevant given the ideological homogeneity of many disciplines who are drawing these boundaries. Isn't this too just theater?
Well, yes, it is theater. I must agree with that. But of course, there are different theaters. And what I want to say is, and this is simply to repeat what I said earlier, the theater of free speech, that is the theater in which the arguments are made about free speech, is a theater in which the central value of free speech has no content. Academic freedom, as the question suggested, has a contested content. That is, there are people who would argue for a different view of academic freedom than mine. My old friend Judith Butler, for example, is one who would make a quite different kind of argument. All I wanted to say is that in the academy, as opposed to free speech, free-floating free speech situations in political and social contexts, in the academy, what it is that you're doing and what it is that you should be free to do are relatively clear. It's still a theater, but it's not as much of a free form theater, I think, as the theater of free speech.
Thank you. And then we've got one more question from Martha. She says, I really appreciated Dr. Fisher's criticism of viewpoint diversity, but there are two typical arguments for viewpoint diversity. One, that it's important for the purposes of political representation, and two, per Jonathan Haidt, that when almost all the scholars in a particular discipline are so similar, politically or racially or whatever, they succumb to serious blind spots. I'm most interested in Dr. Fisher's response to the second reason, i.e., the epistemic reasons to embrace viewpoint diversity.
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. Thank you. Uh, I haven't been looking closely at social science departments for some decades now, but I remember in the 70s and 80s when I was more involved in the university's daily work than I am today, that many social science departments were split between social science influenced by the European sensibility of scholars like Durkheim and Max Weber, and other then there was the kind of social science I'm sorry, social science research, which is more statistical and usually associated with a scholar like James Coleman. What I noted is that there were departments in the universities that I belonged to where social science departments were split down the middle, as opposed as one side being strongly statistical and the other strongly continental in its emphasis. But what I also knew is that 95% of the members of those departments were Democrats. So what that led me to conclude, and it's the conclusion that I would make the basis of my answer to the question, is that partisan identification or self-identification as a Democrat, as an independent, as a conservative, etc., partisan identification and your identification with particular positions in the academic world are independent variables. So it's always said, it's always trotted out over and over again by people, by another old friend of mine who is now unfortunately deceased, Horowitz, who is in fact the inventor of viewpoint diversity, and also by Christopher Rufo and others today. It's always pointed out that in this such and such a department in Harvard, Yale, Stanford, MIT, or wherever it is, 55, department of 50, 47 of them are Democrats and 3 are Republicans. To which I say, and I really mean this strongly, so what? I am a slightly left of center Democrat, very slightly, as my wife would complain, very slightly left of center Democrat. I also am, for a long, long time, a member of the community of Milton scholars. And in the Milton scholarly world, since about 1795, this is amazing. There's only been one great question. Is Satan the hero of Paradise Lost? And the Miltonists are always divided along that by that question. Some arguing that the authority of God in the poem is finally regnant and strong. Others arguing with Blake and Shelley that all of the energy belongs to Satan and that Milton's revolutionary sympathies also belong to Satan. Clearly, these are the left and the right of the Milton industry. I'm a left of center Democrat, but in that particular dispute, I'm far on the right. Again, there's no relationship between my partisan political commitments and my academic commitments. I'm not saying that that's the case for everyone, because there are people, I've known people, and some of you have known them too, I'm sure, for whom their political commitments dictate or at least influence in some way their academic judgments. I don't think there should be such people, or rather, I think that such people should reform themselves, but they're there. And what do you do about them? This is the administrative problem, which I felt keenly as a dean. What do you do when you find out that the faculty member, or perhaps even an entire department, has crossed the line and is no longer engaged in academic inquiry, but is engaged in some kind of political proselytizing, perhaps somewhat disguised as academic inquiry? What can you do in a situation like that? And I think everything depends on there being a certain kind of administrator, a kind that is less and less seen. You have to step in and say either to the individual faculty member or to the department, you can't do that. That's not what we do here in the academy. I remember when I was a dean, we at the University of Illinois at Chicago inaugurated a Native American Studies department, one of the first, I think, Native American Studies department. And I presided as a dean. It was my job to provide what are called welcoming remarks, an administrative genre all in itself, which deserves some academic research and analysis, actually. So my welcoming remarks to this group at a luncheon were very simple. I said, it's quite true that what brought you here to the point where you now have a place in the academy was political activism. That is, you and others who were supportive of you politically worked to create an academic space in this university. Now that that effort has succeeded and you're in the university, forget the politics. Because if you don't, you will not gain the respect of your peers in the rest of the university. I still believe that strongly. And I wanted to thank all of you for participating in this very engaging and spirited discussion.
Thank you, Stanley. Are we pretty much out of time, Stanley?
I'm not out of time.
You're not out of time? Okay, okay, we can
I'll
keep
talk
going.
forever.
Okay.
I wonder,
Unfortunately.
I wonder if I could
Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey.
jump back in, Andy. Um, and because it's a heterodox meeting, my mind always goes back to what heterodox is trying to be heroically, but perhaps not quite managing to be. Go back to our last heterodox meeting that Neil kindly set up with Alan Sokol, and I was trying to hold his feet to the fire in the same, in this way that viewpoint diversity in heterodox is always defined in some ways quite rightly by evidence and the search for truth, right? And we don't quite get into the puzzle of what truth is going to be in those contexts. But I'm always seeing this drift over to in the direction where the humanities and literary study generally, where there is a more radical relativism, even in those terms, what is going to stand as evidence and so on, that it's going to marginalize the humanities. It's going to marginalize literary studies for the very reason that, you know, Sidney's "The Poem Never Lieth because it nothing affirmeth" and so on. That it is its hesitancy to make truth claims that is going to leave it out of the picture. And I'm just wondering, Stanley, how you have solved that in your career, because you're right at the heart of it, right? You've got the Milton affiliation, and then you've got this other side where there must be, or inevitably will be, social outcomes.
Well, I've only survived it because I've lived so long. But I think the decline of the humanities can be understood and analyzed, and has been understood and analyzed by many people, Christopher Newfield, and others. For me, and this is perhaps an oversimplification, the elimination, or at least yeah, more or less the elimination of distribution requirements was the key. I remember when the distribution requirements of a strong kind were in place, that any undergraduate student had to take so many courses in these areas, or if you were an English, or if you were an English major, you had to do this, that, and the other thing, and study philology in various language and so forth and so on. And someone said to me, but that will mean that students are being forced into courses in which they have no interest. And I said, yeah, that's the point. You want to force students into courses in which they have no interest, not on the base, and on what basis? On the basis that you, as an instructor and as someone who has studied his material and been given a degree from a respectable university program, you have a sense of what it is that students should learn. And that should be a sense which has an administrative and a curriculum representation. But once you give students the possibility of bypassing entirely the humanities, they will bypass entirely the humanities, and there you are. I remember back in Berkeley, I taught a course in 17th century poetry which had 385 people in it. Uh, I doubt that that experience is being repeated anywhere today.
Mhm.
Great. I think, Neil, do you have your
Right.
hand up? Did you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, sorry, Neil.
Yes, yeah, I just had a comment and maybe a question for Stanley. The comment is just we're talking about different nations and the regimes of labor relations and the like. But I've been at McMaster for 30 years, and Toronto Metropolitan University used to be called Ryerson. The union there won an arbitration, and it's no longer possible to use teaching evaluations for high stakes judgments. And that's been kind of spreading. McMaster has backed off from doing that, even though it's not, it wasn't, we don't have a union, unfortunately, in my view. But anyway, so that's sort of, and my teaching has improved a lot in the last few years because you take away the teaching evaluations, and I'm in a privileged position, and so that's sort of that's one comment. But the question I have is, I mean, I wonder if the difference between sort of like mandatory trigger warnings or the incident that Jeffrey outlined as distinct from sort of pedagogical things? I mean, don't you think maybe in sort of contemporary issues, there might be times where it's a good idea to give people a sense, a heads up on certain kind of violence or other kind of events, just as outside of literature, but contemporary events or other things as a kind of a, maybe
Tell me why you think it's a good idea.
well, I can see some students being traumatized by events in their lives, and it would be, not something like a requirement if you're reading a literature from the past, but probably a good idea to give people a heads up. Just that's
Well, let me see. The class, I teach another course in addition to the history of rhetoric course this semester. I'm teaching a course in American Western films, uh, starting with 1929 up to Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. And the movie that I showed and discussed on Wednesday was Sam Peckinpah's movie The Wild Bunch. Um, Perhaps easily one of the most violent movies ever made. Certainly one of the most misogynist movies ever made. And every kind of disturbing action that one might contemplate is presented in that movie, being performed without any sense that the director is inviting us to condemn it. In fact, is in some ways inviting us to enjoy it. Um, I can't imagine. I don't know what I would have said to my students in preparation for their viewing of this movie. I didn't. I said, you may be offended by this, that, or the other thing. I suppose I could have said. I suppose I could have said that. But in my mind, they had signed up for a course in the history of Western film in relation to the cinematic making of the American myth. And if they had signed up for that course, they were required to engage with significant artifacts in that history. The Wild Bunch is a significant artifact in that history, and therefore I didn't feel that I needed to contextualize it in that way for anyone.
Stefan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if this exchange, has come to a natural end, I'd like to go back to something that Stanley Fish said a little earlier. Uh, so in general, I agree with the sentiment that there's a distinction between political activism in the classroom and academic inquiry. But I'd like to hear more thoughts on how to maintain that distinction, particularly given that a lot in many subjects, not just the humanities, but even in medical schools and engineering programs, you have the object of inquiry is some version of what ought we do.
Mhm.
What is the right answer to what we ought to do? I'm in political philosophy, philosophy of law, and questions like that come up a lot. And so, how do you maintain that distinction between crossing the line in political activism? And because of course, in philosophy departments, you'll have libertarians, you'll have Republicans, you'll classical Republicans, you'll have various kinds of liberals. They very different ideas on what we ought to do, and they defend theses about
Yeah.
which set of ideas. Where do you
Well,
cross
from
the line from political activism to
Well, for
engaging in
many for
inquiry?
many years, up until about 3 years ago, I was for 25 years a professor of law.
Yeah,
So I, of course, I recognize the landscape that you're describing,
yeah.
and of course, laws are involved with precisely that questions: what should one do? What ought one to do? What can one be punished for doing?
Yeah.
And etc. And what I tend to do is hold to a simple formula. Politics and political issues can always be brought into the classroom so long as they are objects of academic interrogation and not potentially objects either of admiration or rejection. In other words, no matter what it is, you can, and this is a word, an ugly word that I coined in the book, uh, Save the World on Your Own Time. You can academicize any subject. And what you to academicize a subject, you remove it from the real world urgency in which it has its political life. And instead, you transfer it or even translate it into the academic urgency of trying to understand a phenomenon, an object, a movement, a set of ideas. So as long as that's the stance you take toward it, either a political position or a set of political events or various political leaders, you say, okay, let's take a look at this. What are they like? What are the principles here? What are what is energizing this movement? What movements in the society is it related to or is opposed to? Where did it come from? Within the last 100 or 200 years, have there been other forms of this? In other words, the more you ask questions like that, the more the immediate political urgency of the topic that you're examining fades away into the background. So that's what I say. My old friend, again, unfortunately, recently deceased Frederick Jameson, always said, always historicize. And I say, not in opposition to Fred, but I say always academicize when you're an academic.
Thank you.
Yeah, if we may, there's a couple more questions now from attendees.
Sure,
So if that's okay.
sure.
Um, so again, anonymous. So Dr. Fish underlined a number of examples at the end of his argument, which, in his mind, constituted violations of academic freedom. One such example that stood out to me were organizations that stood for intellectual diversity, because it's an inherently political stance that detracts from the process of academic inquiry. Do you think that it's possible for organizations to consider themselves champions of both academic freedom and intellectual diversity?
No, that's very simple. They're two different things. I can think of a place for something like intellectual diversity in the academy, in the academic experience. This is no longer the case in most places, but I remember when there were lots of courses with the title Approaches to. So that I've taught courses in approaches to legal interpretation, which has been for the last 30 or 40 years a hot topic in the legal world. If I call a course approaches to, I am in effect entering into a contract with potential students. I am going to introduce you to a field where there are contested accounts of central issues, and it's part of my responsibility to introduce you to all of the contestants, at least those who have received some kind of hearing in some parts of the university. So intellectual diversity, therefore, in a course like that, is mandated. Or suppose I was not teaching my standard course in the poetry and prose of John Milton, which is entirely based on Milton's theology. That's, of course, by far not the only way to teach Milton. There are millions of ways to teach Milton and millions of books like Milton and Plato, Milton and music, Milton and science, Milton and race, the Hebraic Milton and so forth and so on. I don't do any of those. I just do Milton's theology and its relationship to the construction of his works. But suppose I was teaching another kind of course called Approaches to Milton. Then everything would change. It would be my obligation to introduce the students to perspectives on Milton that I myself did not fully follow out in the other course. So insofar as there are those kinds of courses, which we might call anthology courses, then in those kinds of courses, intellectual diversity or something like it is an appropriate measure.
Okay. Great. And maybe we'll finish with one more question from the audience, going back to something that was discussed earlier. So the person said, I agree with Neil. I think this is about a broader question. Is university only about cultivating reason, or is it about developing empathy? If students attend a class and some of them are survivors of sexual violence, they will have a post-traumatic stress disorder related reaction if they are shown, for example, a rape scene. This can cause an actual serious harm to their mental health. So I guess the question is about, is university just about developing knowledge, knowledge, et cetera, or is it about something more that we're trying to give our students, like empathy, for example?
Well, of course, there's been a whole bureaucracy which wasn't in place when I first came into the academy, involving student affairs and offices that help students to make their way, and also other offices to which students can repair when they are having either physical or psychological uh, difficulties. I think that in general, it's a good thing that there are such units in a university, but I don't think that the instructor can take it upon himself or herself to be that kind of person who is on the lookout for the possible psychological, um, I don't know even know what the word should be. Um Psychological trouble spots of his or
Hmm.
her students. Now, when one does emerge, when a student comes, either stands up in class or comes to be an after class and says, I'm afraid that I can't really attend the next class if we're going to continually discuss this material because I find it really disturbing, then I'm going to try to work something out with the student whereby the student could do something else or could could substitute for what was so disturbing, another object of study. That usually doesn't happen, but in general, I would have to say that it's not our business to be empathetic, but nor is it our business to be rude and hostile. If you spend your time scorning students or making fun of them, which I used to do, and still at times cannot resist doing. I remember, for example, early on, ridiculing some student because he was poor. If I did that today, I would be out of a job by the afternoon, and probably justly so. So I hope that I don't err too much in the direction of unconcern, but a full concern with both the physical and mental health of my students would be an obligation that I don't think I should have, in part because I would not have any of the expertise that would allow me to perform that obligation in a serious way.
Thank you. Great. Well, I think we should probably wrap things up. Were there any sort of final comments that people wanted to make? I just want to say a huge thank you to Stanley. This has been fantastic. Stefan, Jeffrey, and Ewelina, any final statements?
If I
Just
may
talk
just
about
chip in
it.
because,
Yeah. Sorry.
um, okay, sorry. Because I'm also a psychotherapist and a professor. And actually, sometimes I find myself in a in a situation that's impossible to solve in a classroom because as an academic, I cannot really pay attention to all students' reactions, and sometimes what triggers them is really hard to predict. Last year, I had the situation in which I showed students a theater play in which one of the characters pretended, just pretended to vomit. After that, a student came to me and said that was very, very triggering for her. She was almost crying. Then she also commented upon this in the students' evaluations, and that I show some extreme material without warnings. And that was a situation in which it wouldn't even have come to my mind to
Right, right,
issue a
right.
warning because that was the character pretending to vomit, right? So I feel sometimes really torn between these roles, the professor and the psychotherapist, because these are very, very different roles. In order to console someone, to soothe them, you need a personal relation, kind of a personal relation, and a much deeper relation. It's a relation on a much deeper level that would be really inappropriate in the academic setting. So I personally would actually tend to agree here with Professor Fish, because I find these roles very distinct and impossible really to combine.
Yeah, the question of roles is very important. There was a legal case that some of you may know, where a student in a theater program was of course studying acting in this program, and what she was upset by was the request at certain points that she act out a role uh, and and how shall we say, take on a persona as an actor, uh, totally antithetical to her beliefs, and she didn't want to do that. And of course, the response to that on the other side was, but that's what acting is. Uh, that is taking upon yourself and in some ways presenting characters and personalities other than your own. That's why we often admire some actors who quote unquote disappear into the character. So I don't think that conflict can be easily resolved by a formula. I assume that the person who didn't want, in the course of her training to be an actress, who didn't want to do certain kinds of acting exercises because they violated her principles in some way, was extremely sincere. I also understand the position on the other side, the administrator's position, says, but this is what we do, and if you don't want to do this, maybe you don't want to be an actor or an actress. I don't think there are any, at least I don't see any easy answers to those questions.
Right. Jeffrey, any sort of final
Yeah,
comments or
I
yeah.
just to express gratitude being able to listen to Stanley Fish work out these puzzles, and to say for myself that what makes him ultimately trustworthy is that he has, over the length of his career, had to play tennis on both sides of the net. He has chosen a side which is the primacy of the social outcome. But he has lived also on the side of what fictive speech might actually be, and he understands both of those. And once you intuit that, you really recognize that you have to listen, that you can't just pigeonhole these views one, oh, that's wrong, and so on. It's really about his energy of mind and the process of thinking through puzzles that he's a wonderful example of.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I played tennis this morning
Oh my
just
gosh,
before this
you.
event, and I am happy and pleased that none of you saw it.
Great. Stefan, any final comments?
No, just thanks for this opportunity. This is great to be able to talk to Stanley Fish about these issues and the other folks on the panel.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Stanley. Again, this has been amazing, and Jeffrey and Ewelina and Stefan, and Neil for putting this all together. This has been a really fascinating exploration, and yeah, thank you to Heterodox Academy as well for helping to fund these initiatives and make these things happen. So, yeah, I'm going to stop the recording, and
Thank you all.
thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.